I'm now going to introduce the chair for this session, Pat Mitchell. Pat is founder and partner of Connected Women's Leaders. Connected Women's Leaders Initiative are hosting all three of our conversations on climate, and we're greatly thankful to be in partnership with them. She's the editorial editor of TEDWomen. She's an Emmy Award-winning producer. She's the chair of the Sundance and Women's Media Centre boards, and she's trustee of the V-Day movement. So, Pat, it's just fantastic to have you here with this fantastic range of guests that you've assembled. Really, really grateful to have you here.
Well, team, to have put this together already. I'm already feeling more informed, definitely inspired, as I always am, by a global convening of women of the world. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of it, Jude. I'm especially excited about the session to follow because it personifies what I believe so deeply and have been a lifetime advocate for, and that is women's leadership. Women learning from one another, sharing our stories, leading in very different ways that are leading to different kinds of outcomes. We're seeing that play out in real time right now, as it's probably safer if you live in a country led by women. Statistics are proving that during the global pandemic. What I have observed with the three women who join us today is these are women who are willing to take risk, willing to step up and speak out against injustice, willing to show up for one another so that together, collectively, we are problem solving in ways that lead to a more just and sustainable future. So please allow me to welcome these extraordinary women leaders who are leading for climate justice. First, welcome Mary Robinson. Mary has done so many things in her life as a leader, and as the former president of Ireland, certainly took risks, spoke up, stood up, and now continues to do that as chair of the elders. And Mary actually put the idea of climate justice forward in her book, Climate Justice, which for me explained in a very different way the crisis of climate and how we as women had a particular role to play in creating a future that solved the environmental crisis in a way that was more just for everyone. Mary, welcome. It's always a pleasure to do any conversation with you. And I should mention also that you're hosting conversations regularly on your new podcast, Mothers of Invention. I'm going to introduce our other two guests as well and then come back to you, Mary, for the first question. Also welcome today, Fatima Ibrahim. Fatima describes herself as a lifetime advocate for climate justice, and that means she's been doing that for all of her 26 years. Thank you for being on the front lines, Fatima, all of your 26 years. And what we're excited to hear about today is your current work as the co-director of Green Deal UK. Welcome. Christiana Figueres. If there's anyone who personifies leading by collective diplomacy, it is Christiana. Throughout her entire career as a diplomat, as a leader, she has exercised the power of bringing people together, building bridges, finding coalitions and alliances. And that ultimately led to her work in leading the framework for the UN's climate change conference, famously known as the Paris Conference, because there 195 countries were encouraged and did, in fact, sign a global climate agreement. And Christiana led that work. She talks about it in her new book called The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. And if there's ever been any doubt that we wouldn't solve the climate crisis and that we can be optimistic if we make the right choices, Christiana's book gives us the way forward. Welcome, women leaders, leading us.
Thank you, Pat. Lovely to be here with all of you.
Thank you. I feel when I look at the three of you that we will most definitely move from the brink of this environmental crisis to a future that will be more just and sustainable. But we are doing so now, you are doing so now, in a climate of all other kinds of challenges we could not have imagined. A global pandemic, a reckoning long overdue, racial equity. And I want to start with you, Mary, because the challenge we're hearing now is how do we keep climate and this existential threat forward when there are so many other urgent threats affecting us daily? How do we do that, Mary?
Well, thank you, Pat, and I'm delighted to participate with you, with Fatima, and with Christina in this WOW Global 24 event. Last January, I was depressed that what we call business as usual was not leading us to a safe world. It was not taking the climate crisis seriously and was leading to catastrophe. And also, our world was full of inequalities and injustice. Then COVID-19 hit in a health crisis, then an economic crisis, and increasingly a social crisis. We know the wise words never to waste a serious crisis. COVID-19 has been like a mirror to our world. Although it's global, it has not been a great leveler. It actually has exacerbated all the inequalities of poverty, race, gender, being a migrant or seeking asylum, being a person with disabilities, being a girl out of school in the developing world who'll be pushed into child marriage because she'll never get back to school. But the feminist movement has also taught us the intersectionality between these inequalities, how they are linked. And we need to create links between the movements for justice in our world today. Black Lives Matter, which has already been talked about, women marching for Me Too issues and also for against violence against women, children striking for Fridays for Freedom, for future, sorry, social movements and those fighting inequalities against autocratic regimes. My focus, as you know, has been on fighting for climate justice. And I've identified 5 layers of climate justice. The first is that it affects disproportionately the poorest countries who are not responsible. The second injustice is the gender injustice, but within that it's women who don't have the same power or the same rights like land rights or access to credit, and yet they have to put food on the table, go further in the drought, etc. The third layer is the intergenerational injustice that the children have reminded us of. The fourth layer is the subtle injustice of the pathways to development. The rich world built its economy on fossil fuel and has to take itself off. The poorer countries, before Paris, and Christiana will remember this, committed to going as green as possible, but they need the investment, the jobs, the skills, and we're not doing that enough. We need more solidarity. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself. We had a report in May last year about the extinction of 1 million species. We know we're not living in a way that's compatible with Mother Nature. So there's also the wisdom of Indigenous peoples, that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from you, our children. And I believe, Pat, that if women were in charge of their right proportion of power in the world, meaning half the power in the world, that we would get a global recovery plan for COVID-19. We would get a global New Deal based on zero emissions globally by 2050. We would get a global biodiversity strategy so that we would build a fair, green, and resilient economy with nature and our environment at its heart. And that is what women must be striving for together in this WOW event and throughout. And I just end with a man, because he was the founder of the Elders, Nelson Mandela, and he said, "It always seems impossible until it is done. It always seems impossible until it is done. So let's do it."
Mary, what perfect words for this conversation and for everything that we'll be talking about throughout this gathering. And Christiana, I just have to come to you from that statement because you said not that many years ago, and you've quoted yourself many times, that when you were asked, will we solve this crisis, the climate crisis, in your lifetime? And you said, no, not in my lifetime. And then you changed what everyone was saying was impossible to the possible by creating that first ever global climate agreement. How are you feeling now about where we are and getting to that future that, as Mary said, we as women leaders can choose and lead forward towards?
Well, first, Pat, thank you very much for inviting me to join Mama Mary, as I very lovingly call Mary. I so put Mary on a pedestal. She must be, like 10 feet tall by now, because the pedestal only keeps on growing, the pedestal that I have built for her. So it's wonderful to be here with Mama Mary. And how wonderful to be here on screen with Fatima, who was just, before we went on screen, reminding all of us that she was one of the young leaders who was participating in an informal way in the conferences, and always had, honestly, the most insightful, brilliant questions that made you really think and go, maybe we're not being ambitious enough. Maybe we have to push farther. So how wonderful. And Pat, thank you very much for bringing us all together under your magical wand that you tend to wield quite frequently. Let me take what Mary so eloquently put forward and just give you one more layer of depth to what Mary has put out. And that is the injustice that we are currently living right now with COVID and the intersection with climate. Because I think everyone will understand that the fact is that because the world is so interconnected, it always was, but it's now evidently so. It just took us a very long time to realize of the interconnectedness. The fact is that we cannot solve one crisis, whether it is the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the gender crisis, the COVID crisis, the economic crisis, the inequality crisis that is at the bottom of all of this. We can't solve any of them without bringing some healing and some improvement to the others. Conversely, if we do not take at least one or two or three of them and move forward, then we're only deepening the crisis. So it's both a huge responsibility, but it's also a big opportunity. But let me just take this one, as I said, one step further, because I'm very glad that Fatima is going to be talking to us about the Green New Deal in UK. Here's one way that we can be looking at the exit from the COVID crisis. We could either be repairing some of the jobs and some of the employments and putting in the cash that is needed to get the economy back up off of its knees and back on its feet, in a way that we're only building back to where we were last year, which means we would resuscitate sectors and economies that are heavy in carbon and heavy in injustice. Because what we have to put into our mind is carbon equals injustice in all the ways that Mary has just put out for us. So the fact is that now governments are indebting themselves maybe all the way up to 20 trillion. 15 trillion is already confirmed, but they could go up to $20 trillion of debt that they are incurring. These are governments across the world incurring in order to address the economic part of the COVID crisis. What we have to understand is that that money, because it is debt, will not be paid by Pat, Mary, or Christiana's generation. That debt will be paid by Fatima's generation. And therefore, we now have yet another proof point of climate injustice. potentially. Because if that money is injected fresh into the economic system, and the only thing that it does is to strengthen the carbon intensive sectors, the carbon intensive companies, then we're accelerating emissions and we are frankly condemning ourselves to decades of high emissions because the financial decisions that are being taken over the next 3 to 18 months will clearly determine the structure of the economy on this planet for at least 1, if not 3 decades, because of the scale of it. Because of the scale. We have never put $20 trillion into the economy. So this is it. This is it. This is the way. We used to think, well, we have 3 or 10 years to address climate. We don't anymore. We have 3 to 18 months. And it has to be embedded into those recovery packages. It has to be seen through generational justice lens, through climate justice lens, through social equality lens. And if we do that, then we will be able to set the basis for a thriving economy for decades to come. But we are looking basically at the starkest choice we have ever made and the most urgent choice, because it's not about years. This is months in which these governments are going to be making or are already making this choice. So never have we've been presented with the depth and the urgency of a choice around justice as we are right now. The good news about it is if we make the right choices, and the European Union is already moving in that direction, and surprisingly China as well, then we can do more for climate, for gender justice, for intergenerational justice, for social justice. We can do more for all of those issues than we even conceived that we could do. So, the vastness of the possibility is staring us in the face, but we have to step into it.
And so Fatima steps into it with all of this placed on your beautiful shoulders, Fatima. We are counting on you and your generation. And when I read your story, I am so inspired that you came into this world at one of the darkest moments in terms of climate negotiations. Now you are in a world where there is a global agreement, but then all these other intersectional issues have occurred and challenges. And yet you have chosen, as both Mary and Christiana have referred, to focus on how do we solve this from the economic point of view to find the justice we're seeking. In what ways will the Green New Deal do that?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and it's good to see everyone on the call. And honestly, have to change what I was going to say because I don't know whether I can match the way that Christiana sort of powerfully assessed where we're at, and Mary's sort of overview of what climate justice is. For me, you said I was born into a climate emergency. The UN system that was sort of set up to deal with this climate emergency came together 6 months before I was born. So that's why I've always felt like dealing with the climate emergency, fighting so that we can avoid the worst impacts that my generation will have to deal with, is going to be my lifelong mission. Just to sort of take us back a few months ago, that Mary sort of mentioned, I was also extremely depressed in January. In 2019, we saw this explosion of climate activism around the world. The youth strikers out on the streets, Extinction Rebellion, climate was going up the agenda. And at least in the UK, the climate agenda suffered a massive blow at the end of last year when a political party that had committed to quite radical demands on climate lost the election. And for many of us, we were sort of grappling with how do we tell the story of where we're at and how do we drive this sort of change that needs to happen with the political reality that we're living in. Fast forward 4 months, and not only are we having the conversations that we wish we were having, we're having conversations far beyond what I could have ever imagined what I could have ever dreamed we would be discussing in 2025, 2030, let alone 2020. And that's the sort of hope and place of hope that I want us to begin with, is we have fast forwarded the conversation on climate more than we have in the last decade, in the last 4 months. We are having conversations all over this country and around the world about what our societies value. Who are the workers and the jobs that are part of our society's immune system? It's the healthcare workers. It's our carers that in our homes that are undervalued and underpaid. It's the people who stack shelves in our shops and our groceries. It's the postal workers that are making sure that we can still keep in communication with each other. And it's all of these sectors that are both low carbon and form the low carbon industry that are completely left out of the conversation, that are undervalued and underpaid. What's fantastic about the Green New Deal is the Green New Deal is a climate justice campaign. It's a justice campaign. It's about economic justice. It's about racial justice. It's about social justice. It's about environmental justice. And at the heart of that is we need to deal with the inequality crisis. Because the biggest thing that's standing in the way of justice is that we have an unequal world. We don't have the same access to power. We don't have the same access to resources, both in our communities but in the world. The global north, has amassed wealth off the back of colonialism, extractivism, exploitation of enslaved peoples that built the wealth in the north. In our own communities, women are subsidizing our economies by doing free labor. And that's really holding up the care economies that allow workers to enter the workforce. It's our mothers, it's people taking care of our elderly, and that's, as I said, entirely unpaid. The Green New Deal is putting forward an agenda that says we need to tackle this and reshape our economies and figure out what now needs to be at the center of our economies and build around it. And what recovery does, as Christiana said, is gives us a springboard to build back better from this and reshape our economy. Pre-corona, we had a huge battle of telling the story and telling people, hey, our system's not working for us. We need to dismantle it and rebuild it. Well, now it's broken, and there is no sort of debate about the fact of building it back. It's just how we build it back. And what we need to do in building it back is build a fair, more just world that allows us to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis, that puts values in the things that matter to all of us, that rebalances who has access to power, and that means democracy, making sure that at the local level communities have power over access to their own resources, access to energy, and the decisions that they make to collectively manage the natural environment, but also people, because currently we have a society that's not just exploiting the planet, but exploiting people everywhere, the vast majority of us, actually.
Fatima, seldom have I heard the intersectionality of all of these issues so brilliantly articulated. Thank you for that. And honestly, I'm feeling already more hopeful than I was 10 minutes ago, knowing that your generation, and we don't mean to put undue pressure on your very capable shoulders, but we are, in fact, looking to the leadership of your generation. And we know that we got to where we are because of the leadership of Mary and Christiana and so many other extraordinary women around the world. So that's a beautiful assessment as to where we are now. So Mary, what do you see next in this environment where, as Fatima says, we have an opportunity? We're having a different kind of conversation now because of what's going on in the world. So what is the next step from your point of view? How important are the global agreements, for example?
Yeah, I think we have to try and join the voices that have been pointing to the injustices, for a start, as a pressure on governments. It's governments that have the main responsibility. And we know that what is actually needed is that every country, every city, every corporation has to commit to being zero emissions by 2050, and then work backwards. Where will I be in 2030? Where will I be in 2025? Where will I be? And so the The Sustainable Development Goals help us. The Green New Deal, the strategy for the protection of the biodiversity, all of these are important. But I think more than anything else, it's a feat, it's a kind of imagination. Let me put it very simply in my terms as a human rights person. I often quote the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But actually now our vision has extended, and it has extended and connected with all of the species who share this planet with us and the ecosystems that sustain us. And that's a stretch for human rights, just as human rights would have been a stretch for the environment and the climate convention. And we need to join those up in a way that really compels. And we actually know what we need to do, as I said. We're hearing about recovery in countries, and we're hearing about recovery in the European Union, 750 billion for a COVID recovery. But think of the rest of the world. We need a global recovery. The developing countries have lost their remittances, most of them because those who sent remittances have lost their jobs. Capital has flown out of the poorer parts of the world. They have a huge debt. So we need a real kind of something that is compellingly strong in debt relief and in support for developing countries where the problem has moved to now, the problem of COVID, and their health systems are much weaker, so that we can all build a more resilient world, a world where the dignity and worth of everybody is recognized, but also the link with nature. It is very doable. All we need is that political will driven by a determination from the bottom up. And it's that determination that gives me great hope. And it's young people like Fatima that give me particular hope.
I want to come back to you, Fatima, on that point. Where, because you do give us hope, and you've certainly articulated the challenges now, but also the opportunity. So what next for you and this generation of climate activists? How do you take advantage? As Mary said, a crisis is too good a thing to waste. So what do you do next now to move Green New Deal and any other kinds of economic and other justice and equality, or the fight for equality, forward?
Yeah, I think the challenge for us now is to build power. I think one of the things that's happened with the pandemic is that we've had to completely change the ways in which we campaign, the ways in which we build power. But we're resilient, and it's been amazing to see how communities have been base building. We might not recognize it as such, but through mutual aid groups that we've seen across several countries of communities coming together. My local community has a WhatsApp group with people I've never spoken to, but they're all my neighbors, about how when someone's in need, we're able to get them their shopping, to get them their prescription. And that is going to be the foundation for the social movement we're going to require to get something like a Green New Deal through. And our responsibility as campaigners, I guess, is making sure that we are investing and putting time into those networks, and that those networks aren't ones that are lost when we go back to normal. Normal can't be us not knowing our neighbors anymore. Normal can't be us not being connected to our communities. It's that community-based building that we've been trying to do for so long that's been sort of supercharged in this time. And it's sad to talk about in many ways the opportunities that we now have without recognizing, obviously, the great loss that has occurred during this period. But the only way that we can do justice is from learning from what went wrong. And in doing that, we need to build back better. I also think there's an opportunity to convince our governments. I often say, I don't know what sort of political party is running our government right now, because in a time of crisis, they have been forced to do and react to the needs of people. Our governments, many of them are operating outside of their economic orthodoxy. They are doing things that were previously unimaginable, for example, from a conservative government. Now, at this sort of point and this juncture of what happens next, what we need to do is make sure that we are communicating and still, taking the power back out onto the streets as Black Lives Matter has done, and laying out the solutions. There's the neoliberal thinker who I have now, for some reason, the name has completely gone from my memory, who said, crisis is the moment in which the ideas that are laying around are the ones that are picked up. And it's our responsibility to make sure that the ideas that are laying around are the ones of the Green New Deal, that our governments are forced to make the right decisions. And our governments, by all means, are listening to some extent. They are feeling the public pressure, and we're not right now faced with austerity like we were in 2008. But the choice that lays ahead for our governments is, in 2008 they did bail out, but they bailed out banks and nationalized the debt. It was people that were faced with austerity, and our banks who got socialism. And now in this recovery, we need to make sure that there is money. Like, the conversation isn't about where is the money. There is no magic money tree, as our government likes to say. The money exists. It's about, where does it go? Does it go to people? Does it make sure that we're not saddled with paying sort of the debts of the airline companies who are being bailed out, and their shareholders are getting the money, but workers are being laid off? So I think there's so much tremendous opportunity, and it really lays in the networks that we've been able to make in this time with our communities.
Thank you, Fatima. And Christiana, this must be warming your heart as someone who practiced the diplomacy of optimism throughout the negotiations, convincing governments that it was in their best interest to unify, to come around. And often that best interest, as Fatima pointed out, is pointing to the economic best interest. And in the book, where you give us the choice, we make the choices of the future we choose. You suggest that there are 10 things that we could do. I know we don't have time for possibly all 10 of them, but how do you frame now the actions that you have put forward in the negotiations, in the book, and in all your work, that there are ways, there are paths forward to economic, racial, climate justice?
Well, as Fatima and Mary have been very eloquently putting forward, there definitely is a path forward. It's not like we have to try to invent how we move forward. We all know. All we have to do is ask our heart. And many times our heart says something and the head says something else. But if we just pause on the head for a moment and ask our heart, what is the way forward, then we actually get an answer. And very often, we lead with the head, and the heart is somewhere in some closet under lock and key. So it's about aligning those two things in order to get clarity on what is the just and right, because it's not just, it's right. Both of those things come always together. Whatever is just is right. And so we have to be able to align that. And I also wanted to pick up on some of the issues that Mary and Fatima have brought out about how the destruction of the status quo, the destruction of what is, has been so dramatic and so profound in this COVID crisis. None of us ever thought way back in January that the destruction would be, and I use destruction very, very literally, right? Because so many things have been destroyed. So you can either see that as a negative, or you can see it as a positive, because we've also destroyed many of the structures that were being the basis for this inequality. So the big question, as both Mary and Fatima and you, Pat, have put forward, is what are we going to put forward that is going to replace that? And so I have actually given up on talking about building back. I'm now talking about building forward, because I think that is actually the idea that we want to communicate. We don't want to build back to where we were. We already know how much injustice that brings. So we're actually talking now about building forward. That's where we want to go, to build forward. And there is what I have been taken by over the past 3 months is the fact that, to a certain extent, and there's a huge caveat that I will also address, but to a certain extent, the fact that we're all having conversations like this from our home, from our kitchen tables, from the dining room, from whatever, I don't know how many bedrooms I have looked into lately, has actually, to a certain extent, democratized that conversation that Fatima is talking about. We are talking about much deeper issues in a much deeper way, out of the depth of our living room, out of the depth of our bedroom and kitchens. And I have seen much more participation in so many of these conversations than we would have had if people had had to travel someplace. It has definitely democratized the conversation, and we are therefore having a much richer conversation, which is absolutely what we need. The huge caveat for that is that we have to remember that 50% of the population of the world doesn't have internet. And so by definition, that 50% that is at the bottom of the pyramid has not been on any of these Zoom marathons that we're all on. And hence, we are not hearing their voices from them. Hence, the huge responsibility that all of us have who do have access to the internet and do have access to these Zoom marathons to keep their interests in mind. Because change in the 21st century, and certainly now in COVID times, is not gradual. It's not linear anymore. It's not incremental. Change is now absolutely exponential, especially now, given the exponentiality that has been injected into transformational systems because of COVID. So because it's exponential, it means it's going to happen deeper and faster than we ever thought it could be. And it could go either way. Hence, our deep responsibility to keep the interests of those people who still don't have internet, keep them in mind. Because by the time the internet reaches them, the economic and social reality of the 21st century will have been set. And we have to ensure that is not set against them again, just like it was last century. So a huge responsibility on our shoulders, huge.
And this responsibility and opportunity, privilege today is that we are talking to women all over the world. They are hearing this conversation and longing, I think, because I believe so deeply women do lead the way forward. For what one thing could they do? So in the 2-3 minutes remaining for us, what one individual action do you give us forward from this day? Mary.
I think it's important actually to talk up women's leadership and the way of leading, because we're seeing that women-led countries are doing well in taking tough decisions, listening to the science, and taking lockdown, and then taking their people with them and coming out earlier. More or less, it's quite noticeable. Women lead in a problem-solving way. They lead in a collaborative way. They lead in a way of thinking of those on the margins, and the way that Christiana has just spoken about, those who are not on Zooms, actually the majority world that is cut off from the power and decision making that would be very affected by it. And there are men who also lead in this way. I mean, you mentioned our mothers of invention. We say that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. And I explain man-made is generic. A feminist solution is one that I hope more and more men will also embrace. But it is that more people-centered, problem-solving, non-hierarchical, non-ego. I mean, the populist leaders are male and egos at the moment. They're preoccupied with their own vanity, basically. That's not going to get us where we need to be. So I think women really need to step up at all different kinds of levels and take our voice, take our place, try to insist upon being at the table, because the balance between both the diversity and all the diversity is what will make the difference. And I'm really proud to take part in this WOW event that so many women will be listening to. Wake up, ladies, wake up, women, wake up, girls. We got to do it.
I'm tempted to leave it there because we all want to wake up everyone. But Christiana and Fatima, last words. Christiana.
Well, hugely underlining what Mary has just said, and perhaps just to complement that, this is a time to reach out to our sisters. This is a time to strengthen the network of women in if you live in an apartment building, find out who are all of the other women who live there. Find out who lives on your block. Find out who lives in your vicinity, in your city, or across the world, because now we can. And let us use this opportunity where our hearts are actually more open than they usually are. It is a moment of vulnerability. Let us use that moment of vulnerability and open heart nature that we are all experiencing right now to strengthen a network of women, in particular of women that we didn't know before, as Fatima has already said. That strength of network of women we can help each other right now, because we all need all different kinds of support. But that strengthening of the network is going to be so critical when we're finally out of the worst part of the crisis, because this crisis is actually going to go through several waves and several phases. But strengthening the network among our sisters, whether we are physically close to each other or not, strengthening those networks, which Pat, you have given your life to, and WOW is doing. This is what we really have to do. This is what we really have to do, to strengthen, to find out who's there, who's across the street, and who's across the world. What other women are there who share the same commitment to steward the planet for our children and for our grandchildren. And let's do that in a daily fashion. It doesn't have to be, save the planet kind of world. It's in our daily habitual behaviors of how we reach out to each other. That is where that network is actually fertilized, and where we can build in order to use that strength when we're really going to need it.
And Fatima, we need you and all of the young women leaders all over this world. It isn't, in fact, the future is in your hands. I know you feel it and you act on it every day. What final words do you give to us?
Yeah, just to sort of build off on what's already been said, I think, again, what has been clear, hopefully, from what I've been saying and what everybody's been experiencing, is another thing that's changed is what we see or deem as activism. Activism is not just being out on the streets, or it's not just doing what I'm doing as campaigning. We can be activists wherever we are. We can be activists in our workplaces. We can be organizing our workforce. We can be activists in our communities, in our renters unions, in our blocks, as Christiana said, getting in touch with our neighbors. And that is where women are already doing the work, and so much power can be done, as Christiana said, in connecting them. The other thing that women should be doing is taking the seat, as Mary said. What we have seen, both not just in the world, but in our own sectors, in the climate sectors, in the policy spaces, and in the campaigning spaces, are overwhelmingly dominated by men still. And the solutions being put on the table are still reproducing the system, are still solutions that are not feminist. And it is women who are leading. It is women leaders, and we've just seen through Jacinda Ardern and what her recovery plan looks like. 11,000 jobs are being created in the New Zealand economy to restore their natural habitats. Those are feminist-led solutions, and these are solutions that women already intrinsically know or are already doing. And by taking our seat at the table, we could be helping to shape what this recovery looks like, what the plan and the Green New Deals to help us to avoid the climate crisis and reduce inequality looks like. Women already exist. We're already half the planet. And it's just about more firmly working together and holding each other and holding the space to steer these decisions.
So Pat, I have to jump in here because I know you want to close, but we cannot close without a huge shout out to you as a leader, but also as a recent author as well. Your fantastic book, Becoming a Dangerous Woman. That's what this conversation has all been about. Becoming a Dangerous Woman, embracing risk to change the world. I mean, It's almost as though, Pat, you knew exactly what was coming. And you wrote a whole book about what was coming. I have no idea how you did that. But the fact that you find the time to write that book, thank you so much. What a gift to all of us.
Thank you for that. Well, I do believe that it is now in these dangerous times up to us dangerous women, right? Certainly the three dangerous women I'm looking at on the screen now. But it's really up to all of us. This is our opportunity, as you have so brilliantly articulated, to step up, speak out, and show up for one another. And that is the way that we will move justice forward across all of the many.
Yeah, if I may, Pat, again.
Mother Mary, you always get the last word.
Yeah, no, not the last word, but just interposing the idea that, we've seen the collective power of people during COVID-19, because that's what's protecting us from this virus. We don't have a vaccine. It's complying with lockdown, social distancing, etc. Right. Can we harness that collective power as consumers to consume less, to have less a waste society? We waste a third of the food in the world. Little habits like that. This is what women can also lead on. But please, you close us out.
Well, there is so much more to come on WOW Global. Conversations like this that give us all the information and inspiration that we need to move forward every day towards a more just and sustainable world. I am deeply grateful for your time and all you do in the world. Thank you.